Well, welcome back. We're going to have a look at James chapter 1 today. That's another significant Bible passage in our discussion about desire and affections and temptation. So, James chapter 1, reading from verse 12 down to verse 15. God blesses those who patiently endure testing, and afterwards they will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him. And remember, when you are being tempted, do not say, God is tempting me. God is never tempted to do wrong, and he never tempts anyone else. Temptation comes from our own desires, which entice us and drag us away. These desires give birth to sinful actions, and when sin is allowed to grow, it gives birth to death. So, big picture here. James writes to, he describes them as the 12 tribes, or these are Jewish believers that are scattered around the Roman Empire, so in exile from Judea. And he writes to them to encourage them to have faith, to endure, for their faith to be put into action in their works and their deeds. But he writes to them knowing that they do face suffering, they do face struggles, they do face pressures and trials. And so the first thing he says is that actually you are blessed. Those of you that suffer, those of you that experience trials or testing. And by the way, the same word can be used to simply refer to testing or to tempting. It probably depends on what the motive and the intent is as to whether tempt or test is better. Because he says that you go through the trial, you go through the testing, but you will receive the crown of life that God has promised for you. And that's very similar to how Paul talks about how suffering is good, because those trials, those afflictions, are being used by God to refine us, to give us endurance, to give us hope. And in the same way, we can face testing, we can face trials, knowing that God is with us and that God has promised to keep us through to the end, and that we will receive that reward of being with Christ on the last day. And then he says, remember when you are being tempted, do not say, God is tempting me. God is never tempted to do wrong, and he never tempts anyone else. So whilst we experience these trials, and whilst there may be the temptation as we experience suffering, as we are struggling in life, there may be the temptation to do wrong, to sin, to give in to the world around us, and to go along with it, to compromise. But what we're not to do is to say that God is trying to tempt us into doing wrong. That God uses those trials, uses our experience of struggling and suffering for good. And if there's an inclination there, if there's a desire to do wrong, and if that's followed through, that's not because of God. We're not to blame God for our sin. You and I are responsible for our own sin, our own wrongdoing. And that's what James wants to be clear about here. God does not tempt, because God has no inclination, no desire to do wrong himself. His desire, as we've been seeing, is a good desire. God's desire is love. God's desire is his own glory. God's desire is holiness. And that also means that because there's no pressure on him to do wrong, he won't do wrong by trying to get us to do wrong. You can never say, God made me do it. And that's very important. When we think about what happens in life, we can we can talk about all the challenges that we face, and we can see how God is at work in them. And I think we can rightly talk about the trials themselves coming from God. I think when we look at Scripture, Hebrews will talk about God using them to discipline us, to correct us, to train us in godliness. But we've got to be very clear about what God's purpose is, so that when we sin, we can never say that's God's will, that is God's intent. And that takes us back to Romans 6, doesn't it? And that point, if grace abounds more when sin abounds, should we sin? And Paul says, surely not, no way, by no means. So if the inclination to do wrong, if the temptation, the desire to do wrong doesn't come from God, where does it come from? And in fact, we can't blame the trials, the testing themselves for us doing wrong. Well, the next verse tells us, verse 14, temptation comes from our own desires, which entice us and drag us away. These desires give birth to sinful actions, and when sin is allowed to grow, it gives birth to death. So it's our own desire. It's what we want, what we desire in our hearts ourselves, that causes sin, that tempts us. And what we're beginning to see here is how distorted desire that is either for the wrong things or the right things at the wrong time or in the wrong way, when that's the situation, that desire begins to tempt us, begins to draw us away from what is good, because I want to get hold of those things. And so in Genesis 2, let's make this practical. In Genesis 2, God puts a tree in the Garden of Eden. It's called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And you could argue that its presence in the garden is a kind of trial. It is something there, and Adam and Eve have been told you not to eat from the fruit of this tree. So there's the test there. Will they trust God? Will they accept all of the good things that God has provided for them? Or will they go and eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? And then Satan, because at this time they do not have a fallen human nature, so it is completely dependent on the external voice of Satan, if you like. But Satan takes the command, don't eat from this tree, and starts to challenge it and question it. And then we see that desire is awakened in Adam and Eve, the desire to be like God, to be autonomous and independent from God, the desire for the goodness of the fruit of the tree. And that is what causes them to sin, to take the fruit. So James says that these desires give birth to sinful actions. So from our desire comes that want, that lust, that craving, and we follow through. And sin begins to grow. So do you see this? Desire grows into sin. Sin grows into death. That it has the nature of death about it. That gives us that experience of death. Now, I think it's important to say some things at this stage. Now, there's been a lot of debate about what other people have said throughout history and how they've understood it, and whether or not they see the desire itself as sin. Some discussion about what John Calvin thought and what others thought. I've written about this elsewhere. I think that one of the problems we've got is that people treat John Calvin as trying to argue and answer the same kinds of questions that people are arguing about today. And I don't think he is, because that comes back to an understanding of how Roman Catholic thinking and approach to sin and temptation and human nature goes. We'll probably talk about that another time. But I think it is important to see what the passage itself is saying on its own terms. And when you see what it's saying, it's very clear there that there is a distinction between the desire and the temptation and the sin. So desire becomes distorted. That leads to temptation, and the temptation leads to sin. We will talk a bit more as we start to develop the anatomy. But what James 1 does is it gives us sort of the outline, the contours of what that anatomy of desire and affections and temptation and sin are. And we will come back to that another time.